Tonight we're going to talk about credit spreads and how this impacts the bankers' profits. Bankers want profits. They do not want to lend to us just out of the kindness of their hearts. They pretend to be Santa Claus, but they're not Santa Claus. This is Santa Claus. The central bank, the Federal Reserve, will lend to the banks at a very low interest rate, and then they get to lend to us at a very high interest rate. The differential between the two is what's important to the bankers. The bigger it is, the better it is for them. This week, our president, Obama, has asked us to all go get refinanced so we can have cheap loans at 4.78%. That is so little. My first mortgage I had in 1978 was over 9%. Back then, housing was very cheap, but to borrow money was very expensive. On the other hand, I had hardly any principal that I owed on the house, unlike today where everybody has cheap interest rates but high principal payments. And remember, when you sell a house, you have to pay off the principal, not the interest rates. And that's what makes it all very tricky. So the president wants us to go out and refinance our houses for one purpose and one purpose only, so we can spend more money buying things, because 70% of America's economy is consumers. We don't produce very much. We consume a great deal. This is an interesting thing, by the way, because the whole point for borrowing money is to buy things. And when you're refinancing your house, you're not buying anything at all. You're trying to reduce your debts so you have more money in your pockets because you're already over your head. And you're often over your head because the principal owed on a house is usually very high. And this is dangerous because you always owe the principal. They don't tell you this. You only owe the interest so long as you have money against your house. But you always have to pay off the entire principal. This is why I tell people it's better to have a high interest rate and a small principal than the reverse, because you don't have a lifetime of debt hanging over your head of, say, $1 million to buy a house that cost me only $200,000 just 15 years earlier. Here is a graph from the Federal Reserve showing how a profit squeeze and a housing bubble work with each other. Over here on the left, we see in 2001 that the spread was extremely small. The Federal Reserve was charging a lot of interest to the banks. On the other hand, when it would drop to 1%, the spread between the mortgage and what the banks were paying the Federal Reserve was gigantic. It was over 1, 2, 3, 4, almost 5.25 percentage points between the two, which is an amazing amount. Here's a graph showing how things have gone from about the time I was born in 1950 until today. And we can see how interest rates climbed to a peak in 1980 and then collapsed. But look what happened to the differential. It was very small up until the peak, and then it grew bigger and bigger, except for little inserts here, the places where the Fed gets in a panic over the housing bubbles it's been creating. So we are now entering a new phase where we're having yet another bubble, just like the one we just went through. At least that's the hope of the Federal Reserve. This is a problem. As we can see here from the CDS bonds, that the bonds have been collapsing. The derivatives market has been undergoing a tremendous strain right now. It cannot handle the fake differentials. We do not have real interest rates anymore. Here's a cartoon I did some time ago about the ABXHE AAA bonds that were being sold to investors as if they were valuable when they really were based on really bad loans given to homeowners who were far over their heads in debt according to the principal they owed. Of course, the central bank was worried about the derivatives market, and this is what the wizards of the Federal Reserve tried to do. They wanted to make the beast invisible so that we could all see that it really wasn't scary, but we can see very clearly it is very scary, and they're struggling with this to this very day. In fact, in today's news is a story about how they're going to have a new derivatives market that will be open and clear, no telephone calls or emails sent explaining the real value of things, which is totally fake. Now they have to prove the real value and be supervised by adults on the outside. Uh-oh. Here we can see how we have lost manufacturing jobs. As everything is offshored, the number of jobs where Americans work in productive manufacturing have utterly collapsed. And the collapse is getting worse, not better. As our trade deficit shrinks lately, our manufacturing base. And here we can see in this colorful graph how we had a huge trade surplus during the Marshall Plan years and during the peace dividend years. The trade surplus began to shrink during the Vietnam War, but once we devalued the dollar and cut the gold standard, it collapsed. In conclusion, ultimately, this is all about how much we owe overall, not the interest rate. Assuming that cheap lending will get us out of the hole we're in because we dug a very deep hole on the amount of money that we actually owe is a false way of looking at things. Our government right now has dug an immense hole to the tune of over $12 trillion on money. That's money we owe to people. That's not the interest on that money. That's the full amount of the money. And we have no way of paying this off. The only way we can pay it off is to raise taxes. And ever since World War II's costs were paid off via fund drives and very high taxes on the rich, 90% in some cases, we have decided to live on debt and not pay back anything ever. This is not a good choice, and we are going to pay for it dearly in another 15 years, right, Fluff? Even my cat knows this. He knows there's not always a free ride, huh, Fluff? We can't pretend to be cats with the Chinese dragon. That just won't work. The dragon wants us to work, not sit around and be petted.